Hi, I'm John Righetti, and for more than 4 decades, I've devoted a lot of my time and effort to the ongoing development of Carpatho-Rusyn culture both in the United States and in Europe. Join me in exploring the most pressing question we have as a community, which is Carpatho-Rusyn culture. Where should we go? We in the Carpatho-Rusyn community are really very fortunate that we've been able to, in many ways, revive Carpatho-Rusyn culture in the last 25 years, and particularly since the fall of communism. And I would say that why that's so significant is because while we think that Rusyn culture has really been under the thumb of others or persecuted for centuries, the reality is that it's been the last century and a half that has been most difficult on Carpatho-Rusyn culture. But to have revived it as we have in such a short period of time is simply not enough. We have to have the discussion now about now from here, where? How do we have to continue to evolve this culture? Why do we want to continue to evolve this culture? What does the future hold for us as a community? I think for us to fully understand that, I do have to, however, explore a little bit about what did happen in the last century or century and a half. And in fact, I tell people it's really in the entire history of our people, the 20th century was most difficult on us culturally. If I took you back to 1868, and when Austria becomes Austria-Hungary, and the Carpatho-Rusyn people are living there in both Austrian Galicia and in northeast Hungary, what is today Subcarpathian Rus and Eastern Slovakia, these people begin to experience really the first heavy leaning with an agenda, a governmental agenda, to exterminate Carpatho-Rusyn culture, particularly in those portions of northeast Hungary. The Hungarian government adopts a policy of Magyarization, which in short is to turn all of its non-Hungarian citizens into good Hungarian citizens who are also ethnic Hungarians. Closes the Rusyn schools along with other schools. It makes Hungarian the official language of all interaction with the Rusyn community. It even influences the Greek Catholic Church to begin to use Latin alphabet and Hungarian language for its administrative purposes. And at that time, one of the things that becomes significant is immigration to the United States. So those of you who are in the United States whose ancestors came at that moment of industrialization also have to deal with the fact that your ancestors were already leaving what was at that point a culturally repressive scenario. These issues of the problems Rusyns had culturally came to the United States because the general feeling was that Rusyn immigrants were not coming to stay. They were coming to make money to go back to buy property. And it was only the laws that were passed in the United States that then limited immigration in the 20s, along with the collapse of Austria-Hungary in World War I, that caused the Rusyn community to remain in the West purposefully. But now what you have, and we've dealt with in this last century and a half, is a Rusyn community in the United States and Canada, a Rusyn community in Europe, and while you'd like to think that they were culturally developing in parallel, they were not, because there were too many governmental and political issues that kept these communities apart and continued by the time we get to the Cold War to separate them significantly, so that as communities they don't even really have contact with one another. But just to revisit very quickly what we experienced culturally as a people is that everyone looks at kind of the moment where Rusyns joined Czechoslovakia in 1919 as the golden era, and to some degree, yes, because they had a limited autonomy to govern themselves and they had the opportunity for their own schools, and Rusyn culture was considered a legitimate culture of the peoples of Czechoslovakia. But as we all know, one, that was a very short window of only 20 years. And two, that was only one piece of the story. Rusyns in what was Galicia had become Poland, had during World War I lived through Tallerhof, being interred in a concentration camp. The first people in Europe, in fact, to have to experience that. So already there is this beginning to structurally limit what Rusyns could do culturally, and an organized effort on the part of Austria at that part to literally eliminate Rusyn leadership. So we're starting to see the decay of Rusyn culture. By the time we get to the late 30s and early 40s and we get to World War II, what's also begun to happen is the threat of Ukrainization that the Communist Party brings. It becomes really the communists in the 1920s who become the first to adopt a policy that Rusyns don't exist, that they are simply a part of the Ukrainian nation. And that becomes paramount for the Rusin community when we get to the end of the war and Joseph Stalin forcibly takes Transcarpathia into the Soviet Ukraine, and the guise that he uses under which to do this is by simply declaring that these people are Ukrainians who must be united with their mother, the Soviet Ukraine. At that moment, whenever that becomes the policy of the Soviet Union, it then becomes the policy of the communist states that develop after that. So Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, as each of them become socialist communist states, each of them adopts an official policy that there is no Rusin community. Now, at the same time, in the United States, where you would think you have incredible freedom for Rusins to develop, there has been a lot going on in the Rusin community, sometimes at the behest of governments like Russia and Austria, and sometimes just within the community itself about who are we as a people. And this is complicated by a significant moment, the church division in the United States, where between what was then the Greek or Byzantine Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church being a tool in some instances for the Russification or the turning of Rusins into Russians for some. So in the U.S. you end up with Rusins who begin to become a part of the Russian community, those who begin to become a part of the Ukrainian community through membership in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and those who begin to take on a Slovak nationality as some way to define who they are because they are now citizens of a new Czechoslovakia. By the 1950s, what really then influences Rusin culture on both sides of the Atlantic is the Cold War. Here in the United States, I've talked to people who lived through that, Rusins who said, you know, we did our Rusin culture in our homes and in our churches, but certainly not out on the streets. We didn't talk about what it meant to be Rusin. We didn't want people to know that we were of East European heritage. And so parallel to that, the same thing happened in Europe. Because of the Communist Party's Ukrainization of the Rusin community, to be Rusin and to maintain Rusin culture, for all intents and purposes, also happened only within the household. It's where Rusin language was spoken most effectively. It was where one considered oneself Rusin. And at that moment, too, what therefore became significant is those two communities, the European community and the American community, were then shut off from one another. Americans were afraid to be in touch with their relatives in Europe. European Rusins were afraid to be in touch with their relatives in the United States. And so there was no ability for the continuation of the development of Rusin culture at that period of time. But by the time we get to the late 60s and early 70s, an American author, Alex Haley, writes a book called Roots, which talks about his doing kind of genealogy research and family story research of his African slave heritage. And Roots becomes what in the United States is known as Roots fever, where people of varying ethnic groups also wanted to explore that. And there was kind of an explosion of the reinvention or the rediscovering of one's ethnicity. Ethnic folk festivals, dance groups, for all groups, and Rusins also used this opportunity to revive themselves. There were a multiplicity of Rusin performing ensembles. Rusins in almost every instance participated in these street folk festivals and communities. And this also initiated the first beginning of Rusins being able to study and learn about themselves in books in the English language, with the creation of organizations like the Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center, which then began to create scholarly materials on what Rusin culture was like. And that looked like Carpatho-Rusyn culture in the United States, as well as other cultures, this roots fever concept would level off. And to some degree it did, until we reached the late 1980s and the fall of communism in Europe. With the fall of communism, something truly outstanding and almost unbelievable occurred, and that's that when the various states of Eastern Europe threw off communist rule, almost instantaneously, the Rusin communities there revived themselves. Every country where Rusins lived, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Ukraine, Romania, everywhere they lived, Rusin cultural organizations developed. With that, Rusin language press developed. Then eventually the study of Rusin language, the opportunity to declare oneself publicly Rusin, and this had an incredible effect, not only on the Rusin community in Europe, but on the Rusyn community in the United States, who now, without this issue of the wall of communism, could go back and visit where their grandparents came from and reconnect with relatives. And so the two communities really fed one another to revive Rusyn culture. The other thing that, of course, is profound was the technology at the time, because now that you could communicate across the ocean via an email, that instantaneousness to the way you could communicate, that communities could reconnect even if they weren't geographically in the same place. So what we then have from 1980s till the present is this incredible redevelopment and renaissance, if you will, of Carpatho-Rusyn culture. In 25 years, we have undone an incredible amount of the damage of the last 150. But it begs the question now for us. So, Rusyn culture has been reestablished. Now what? What needs to happen if Rusyn culture is going to continue to not only survive, but thrive for the next 50 years, 100 years, 200 years? So we've had 25 years of incredible redevelopment and revival of Carpatho-Rusyn culture, both in Europe and the United States. So now what? What needs to be done? Do we continue to advance Carpatho-Rusyn culture, and why? And if we do, how do we do that? We're so fortunate because our ancestors have given us a lot of very rich components of culture that many of us continue in the community, both here and in Europe, to this very day. So we have these wonderful, albeit folk foods, but nonetheless these wonderful foods that are reflective of our culture. Pierogi, the kobasi, the halushki. We also have great folk arts, the strong heritage of singing and folk dance and pisanke and wood carving, pisanke Easter eggs. So embroidery, all of these things that add to and help to define us as Carpatho-Rusyns. We, in many instances, have very strong relationships with our Eastern Christian heritage and how that has shaped our culture and shaped us individually as well. So we have a wonderful basis of an understanding on both sides of the ocean of our culture. But what we have to do to assure its survival is to take it to the next step. To say, how do we further develop Carpatho-Rusyn culture? It begins with, first, defining ourselves as Carpatho-Rusyns. And on both sides of the ocean, this is an issue, though admittedly I think it is more of an issue in Canada and the United States, where when people ask you, if I'm lucky enough to say to you, what are you? And you say, I'm Carpatho-Rusyn, and many people then say to you, what is that? People struggle with what to say. How do I define that? And quite honestly, it's quite easy. We as Rusyns simply are Rusyns and should define ourselves as that. We're East Slavs from the Carpathian Mountains of East Central Europe. When people say to us, and I've dealt with this often with young people, they say, well, when they ask me what language do we speak, and I say to them, well, if the Italians speak Italian and the Spanish speak Spanish, then the Carpatho-Rusyns speak, and they think for a little bit and say, Carpatho-Rusyn? Yes, that's the answer. It's that simple. We no longer have to be put in the context of others. Now, many times the response to that often is so is that like Slovak? Or is that like Ukrainian? Or is that like Polish? And it's really not a valid question. The answer to that question becomes Carpatho-Rusyn is not like anything. It is its own distinct culture in the same way that, for instance, if somebody told you they were Portuguese, you wouldn't say, is that like Spanish? You have some context, and it's easier to do for those people who have their own states, but we have to come to the realization that nation and culture are not synonymous. So are there certainly overlaps in Slovak and Rusyn culture? Sure, but the Carpatho-Rusyn culture is so distinctive that it's what causes us to identify ourselves differently and to be able to continue to progress that culture in its own distinct way. And so Carpatho-Rusyns, despite the fact that they don't have a nation state, are still a valid culture, distinct from all those cultures around them. And in fact, what makes culture culture is its distinctiveness from those other cultures that surround it. But in this current time, we also have to learn that the other components of culture are so powerful that we're not familiar with. We have, for instance, a strong literary heritage. There are lots of Rusyn writers, and we have to learn who they are and how they have contributed to culture. The Rusyn architectural heritage. We know we have wooden churches, but what does that really mean, and what happens within a full understanding of what those people did architecturally? Rusyn choral singing, Bortnyansky, for instance, as a composer. All of these are other components of culture that we have to familiarize ourselves, and therefore we will then get over the whole second-class thing, because we will understand that every component of Rusyn culture is as valid and as rich as every other culture there is in the world, that we contributed in the same way and enriched our community in the same way. We even have a long history of political activism, which many people are not aware of. Not only in Europe, people defending Carpatho-Rusyn culture and a need for Carpatho-Rusyn autonomy, but even the American Rusyn community has this heritage. We need to refamiliarize ourselves with that heritage and to know fully how the Rusyn community has developed in spite of these incredible odds over time. Once having educated ourselves about Carpatho-Rusyn culture and having a fuller understanding for ourselves about what it means to be Carpatho-Rusyn, we must then become unapologetic about being Rusyn. No longer do we have to be put in the context of something else. No matter where we live, we have to begin to identify Carpatho-Rusyn culture as the distinctiveness it is. So when, for instance, one sees a beautiful photograph of a Rusyn village in Slovakia, we have to begin to say that's not a Slovak village, but a Rusyn village in Slovakia. Or if somebody of prominence comes from Poland but who is ethnically Rusyn, we have to identify them not as a Pole, but as a Rusyn from Poland. This is the way we begin to establish the validity and the legitimacy of culture in and of its own right. And the beauty of it is that each of us can contribute to that without necessarily being in any kind of leadership position. Or in fact, I would say to you that actually the profoundness of the next stage of Rusyn cultural development is everybody individually contributing in the ways they can contribute. That no longer does everything that happens within the Rusyn community have to happen through formal organizational structures. And once we become unapologetic about being Rusyn and defining our culture, we have to transfer that to our children and to our grandchildren. And quite honestly, we live in an era where that's easy to do, because there are books now for children in both English and Rusyn describing what it means to be Rusyn and Rusyn culture. And then, because young people are experiential, we should take what we do Rusyn currently in our households and continue it and explain it to them. So that when one has Christmas Eve Holy Supper, explain to your children why you do what you do, why this is a key component of Carpatho-Rusyn culture. Once we achieve this, we then, each one of us, have to say, how can I contribute to the further development of Rusyn culture? And the beauty of the way technology works today is that each of us can contribute in whatever way we contribute. So I wouldn't ask anybody to turn away from those things you're already doing. If you're an Easter egg Pisanki artist, continue to do that. And think about how to use that skill to educate people about Carpatho-Rusyn culture. When you talk about your Pisanki making, for instance, don't broad brush it as East European or as something else. Say, I'm practicing the Carpatho-Rusyn art of Pisanki. Get the word out there. Be able to talk about what components of Rusyn culture actually mean. Continue to do that, but find new ways as well, because the beauty is, as I said, technology allows each of us to contribute in some way that no longer has to be organizational in nature. And we have Rusyn organizations contribute and will continue to contribute very valuable efforts, but you don't necessarily have to do it within the context of an organization. You can do it online, you can do it with groups, but the reality is that you have to get back to that education to make sure that what you are propagating is in fact Rusyn culture. For all of us, because of what you heard me talk about historically, there are those little Slovakisms, Ukrainisms, Russifications that crept in that you have to make sure you're not holding out as legitimate components of Rusyn culture. But again, the educational materials today allow you the opportunity to be able to sort that out. And then one other thing that we need to do if we want to assure the ongoing development of Carpatho-Rusyn culture is that we have to provide financial support. We need to begin to take a portion of the income that we have and say, my culture is important enough for me to contribute money towards it. And there are going to be a number of ways, and are a number of ways, that you can use those dollars to be able to propagate and further develop Rusyn culture. Whether it's in support of some other organization, whether it's in support of the agenda of a particular individual who is helping to propagate it further, whether it's for Americans using dollars to support European activities, but we need that financial support. So if you come to that moment where you say, but I really can't do anything for Rusyn culture, the answer is yes, everybody can, because everybody can at least provide some level of financial support. We Carpatho-Rusyns have been handed these incredibly rich values from our ancestors that we cherish. It is those values that have motivated me and motivate you to want to see Carpatho-Rusyn culture continue and thrive. If we take those values and add education about our culture and propagate that education to our children and financially support it and in essence empower ourselves as grassroots individuals to move forward a Carpatho-Rusyn culture, we will make sure that Carpatho-Rusyn culture not only survives but thrives and continues for generations to come. As a leader in the Rusyn community, I'm really looking forward to our ongoing development, and I'm looking forward to the role that you have played and can continue to play as we move our Carpatho-Rusyn cultural agenda forward. Thanks for watching.